2 moons we had ridden the snow, and not one of us had spoken aloud what we all knew. The child was gone. My sister's son, 2 months old when the raiders cut their way through her hold, the last living piece of Lyrian I had left in this world, and every trail had ended in white silence. 10 leagues past the bonewood we rode that night, past the place where any small breathing thing should still have been breathing, and I had stopped letting myself name what we were really riding to find. Then my great wolf stopped on the ridge and lifted his head. I knew that lift. I had watched him do it the night my father died, and the night Lyrian's hold burned, and the night, 10 winters past, I had first crossed the meltwater into her lands. It was the lift of a wolf who has heard something the wind itself does not yet know. He did not howl. He stood very still, the snow steaming off his shoulders, his ears pulled forward toward the dark below the ridge, and the great long muscle of his back went tight under my hand. "Halric," said Garin behind me. He was my sister's husband's brother, my last living kin by marriage, and he had ridden every league of this search at my left flank. His voice was hoarse from the cold. "What is it? What does he see?" I did not answer him because I did not know. I only knew the shape of my wolf's stillness, and the shape of my own chest, which had gone equally still for the first time in 2 moons. I had not realized until then how much noise grief makes inside a man, the whine of it, the constant low howling. It had gone quiet all at once, the way a bell stops when a hand is laid against its lip. "Down," I said, my voice barely carried, "down to the trees, slow." We went down. 6 riders, 14 pack wolves, 3 torches guttering in the wind. The snow was past the horses' knees, and we had to break trail in turns. The ridge dropped away into a thin spine of pines, and below those pines, in the cup of a frozen meadow, a single thin smoke rose against the snow glow of the night sky. A croft. Not a hold, not a village. A single thatched roof in the wild. Whoever lived there had built far from any pack road, far from any neighbor. My wolf's nose was pulled toward that smoke as if a thread tied him to it. He did not strain. He did not pull. He only turned, with that grave, terrible patience he had, and angled his whole body toward the croft like a needle finds true north. "Halric," Garin said again, lower, "if we have come this far for a stranger's hearth." "Quiet." I am not a man who speaks the word * quiet often. The word silenced him. It silenced all 6 of them. We came down the spine of pines at a walk, hooves muffled, the wolves pacing in a half-circle around us, and at the base of the meadow my wolf went forward alone. He padded across the white, leaving a black trail of prints. He stopped at the threshold of that little croft. He sat down in the snow and looked at the door. And he wagged his tail, once heavily, like a tolling. I had not seen him wag his tail since the night the raiders came. I came off the horse before I knew I was doing it. My boots punched through the crust to the knee. I crossed the meadow on foot, my hand already at my sword belt for the warmth of the handle, not the blade. I did not, I knew already, need the blade. I knew already. I cannot tell you even now how I knew. There was a warmth across the front of my chest that had no business being warm in that cold. There was a hum behind my ribs I had not heard since I was a boy, and my mother had stood me before a window and told me the moon kept watch on her children. There was, above all, the bell that had stopped in me when my wolf lifted his head, and somewhere behind that thatched roof, very faintly, that same bell was ringing, and I was walking toward it. I stopped at the door. I am a king. I have stopped at many doors in my life. This is the only one I stopped at because I was afraid of what was on the other side. Inside that croft, very small, very faint, very thin but breathing, a child was crying. Let me tell you, before I tell you what came next, who she was. She did not have a pack name. She had a given name and nothing more. Soria. Just Soria, the way a single candle is just a candle. She had lived 8 winters in the village called Reedhello at the inside edge of my northern marches, 3 leagues past the bonewood on the cold side of the ridge. Reedhello was barely a village. 40 souls. 3 of those souls bore the pack mark, the other 37, like her, did not. The marked ones called themselves the village. The unmarked ones served at the village's edge. She had come to read hello as a girl of maybe 12. No one was ever sure, riding in the back of a salt trader's cart, asleep on a folded sack of grain, with no parents and no story. Old Bran, the healer, had taken her in. Bran was a hard man who had grown gentle the way some hard men do, and he had needed an apprentice with patient hands. He had said of her once in my hearing, for I had ridden through Reed Hollow on an errand of state 7 years before this night, and I had stopped at his door to take a tincture for a hunting wound. That one is going to be the best healer this valley has seen in 3 generations. She has the gift in her fingers and the grief in her heart, and both of those are needed. I do not remember if I looked at her then. I do not think I did. She would have been 17 or so, kneeling at the hearth with a bowl on her knee, grinding marrow into a paste. A small thing, dark-haired, dressed in undyed wool. The kind of woman a man on horseback does not see. I rode on with my tincture and I forgot her, the way a man forgets a wren in a hedgerow. Bran had died the winter before this night. A bad fever in a bad winter. She had nursed him through 3 weeks of it, and he had died anyway in her arms, asking her to keep his copper bowls and his good knives and to feed his red goat. She had done all 3. She had also kept his cottage, paid his small rent to the village elder in goat's cheese and willowbark tincture, and continued his work, the births, the wound stitching, the broken bones, the slow, long dying of the old, without a word of complaint and without ever, the village said, asking for anything back. The village said other things about her too. The well women said she had no man because no man wanted a girl with no name and no people. They said she was a strange kind of quiet. They said she walked too much in the dark, and that wolves did not bite her, which the well women considered an unnatural thing rather than the gift it was. They said she had taken Bran's cottage as if she had a right to it, and had not she ought to be married off out of charity to one of the elder's sons, who was 43 and a widower with bad teeth. The elder, Maddock, had floated this idea once at a village fire in her hearing. She had thanked him for his kindness, gone home, and the next morning Maddock's son had a bowl of barley porridge on his doorstep and a note saying with the apprentice's compliments, "Please send her no more offers." I learned of this later. I am telling it now because I want you to understand what kind of woman this was, who I had not yet met, who was sitting at this moment by her hearth with a half-frozen child in her arms, the door barred against a blizzard, a kettle on the iron arm above the fire, and her hands more steady than any hands in any of my halls. She had walked out into the blizzard 2 hours before to check her snares. She did this every dusk. It was one of the small habits Bran had given her and she had not let go. The blizzard had come up fast and she had been turning back, her hood pulled close, her arms full of the one hare she had taken, when she heard something thin and small over the wind. She had thought at first a kid, a goat kid. There were wild goats in the broken ground above Reed Hollow, and sometimes they birthed too early in a thaw. She had set down the hare. She had followed the thin sound through the white. It was not a goat kid. It was a bundle in a wolfskin wrap, half buried at the foot of an alder, the skin frosted stiff, and the small face inside it whiter than the snow. A child not more than 3 moons old, perhaps younger. Whoever had laid him there, she did not know whether to call it laid or dropped or hidden, and she would not know for hours yet, had wrapped him well. The wolfskin was thick. The inner swaddle was good linen. There was a little carved bone charm tied at his throat with a strip of red cord. None of it was anything to her. To her there was only a small face, very still, with a thread of breath still moving at the corner of the half-open mouth, and the thread was thinning. She did not stand and think. She did not ask herself who had brought a child to a bonewood ridge in a snowstorm, or where the people who belonged to him might be lying. She bent. She gathered him up. She tucked him inside her own coat against her body. She left the hare in the snow and she ran for the croft, and the alder behind her had its branches full of snow, and the snow came down on the bundle's wolfskin and covered the place where he had been as if no one had ever set him there at all. By the time she barred her door behind her, his breath was a hairline thread. By the time she had the fire built up and the kettle hung, the thread was looped through her own breath, in time with hers. And by the time she had warmed goat's milk in the smallest of Bran's copper bowls and laid the bowl in the ashes to keep its warmth, the child had taken 3 small swallows from a strip of cloth twisted into a teat, opened his eyes once at her, pale eyes, light as river ice, not read-hello eyes, and closed them again, breathing now asleep, against her bare collarbone where she had pressed his small, cold face to bring the heat into him. That was the moment. I will tell it because she told it to me, slowly, much later, in our own chamber by our own fire, with her hand inside mine and her hair undone. I tell it now in her words as nearly as I can. I will fail at it. The truest part of her life happened at her own hearth, in her own arms, with no witnesses but the fire and the child and her dead master's good clay bowl, and I was not there. I was kneeling in the snow at her threshold, not knowing yet that I was where I had been walking my whole life to be. She told me that, when the child's face touched the bare skin above her shift, between the hollow of her throat and the curve of her collarbone, she felt, she could not name it, a warmth that was not a fire warmth. A warmth from inside her own body, as if a slow lamp had been set alight under her skin. She told me it did not frighten her. She told me she has wondered since, often, why it did not frighten her, because she has spent her life suspicious of warmth that comes from nowhere. She thinks now she did not have time to be afraid. She thinks now there was no room in her for fear because there was a child in her arms whose breath had nearly gone out, and the slow lamp was minor business beside the breath. She held the child closer, she said, to give him more of the warmth. He made a small sound, half a sigh, half the first true sound he had made since she found him, and his small hand came out of the swaddle, and the cold, tiny fingers touched her bare skin just below the hollow of her throat, where the warmth had been blooming. The skin under his fingers lit. That was the word she used, lit asterisk. She said it lit the way a wick lights when you touch the candle to it, not a burn, not a sear, a kindling. She said the light spread from where his small hand had been across the front of her chest in slow lines, like the lines that go out across still water when a leaf falls onto it. She said it did not hurt. She said it felt the way she had imagined, as a small girl, the warmth of a mother's hand might feel, if she had had a mother to lay one on her, which she had not. She said she sat very still in Bran's old chair with the child against her body, watching the light move across her own collarbones in 2 soft curves and a paw, for that was the shape it took, 2 crescents and a paw drawn in silver, and she thought, with the strange clarity she said comes over her in births when something is going wrong, I do not know what this is, but I know what to do. Hold the child. Keep him warm. Whatever the silver is, the silver will wait its turn. The silver waited its turn. And out on the ridge above her croft, my great wolf wagged his tail once heavily like a tolling, and I came down out of the pines on my own 2 feet, and the bell behind my ribs rang and rang. I am a king. I do not knock on doors I am about to enter. It is a sour habit of kings, and I have it like the rest of them, and I am telling you so that you understand what I did next was not how I usually do things and was not, I think, my decision. I knocked. I knocked on her door with my gloved knuckle twice, the way a tired traveler knocks who hopes for soup and does not expect much. Garin behind me made a small sound, surprise, I think. We had been kicking doors in for 2 months, but he said nothing. The wind was pulling the smoke sideways off the chimney. My wolf was sitting at my left, his haunch against my thigh, and he was looking up at me with his great gold eyes as if to say yes, this one, this door, go gently. There was a pause inside. Then a woman's voice, low, even careful, said, "Who is there? The hour is late and I have a sick one in here." A sick one, not a hurt one, not a lost one, a sick one. She had decided already in that hour by her fire that whatever had come to her she would treat as a sick one and keep through the night. That woman, whom I had not yet seen, who had been a wren in a hedgerow in my memory 8 winters before. That voice through that door was the first thing on this whole earth that had made me feel I might be able to set down the noise of the last 2 months and not pick it up again. "A rider," I said, "2 months out of Whitemark hold. Lost a child of my blood in a raid by the bonewood, and following the only sign my wolf has given me in 8 weeks. I will not enter your door if you say no, but I am asking you to open it." Another pause. I heard through the door a small sound, a child's small breathing sound, the kind a sleeping infant makes when he sighs into the warmth of the body that holds him. The bar lifted. The door opened. I had not, as I have told you, looked at her 7 years before in Brand's cottage. I looked at her now. She stood in her doorway with her hair down to her waist in one dark braid coming undone, a coarse wool shawl over a brown linen shift, her bare feet on the swept hearthstones of her own threshold, and against the front of her body, wrapped in the inside of her shawl, with his small head tucked into the hollow of her bare throat. The child I had come 2 months and 1,000 leagues of snow to find. His face I knew, his pale river-ice eyes I knew. He was the only living thing left of my sister Lyrian, who had laughed at me once when I was 16 for taking myself too seriously, and had given me back the rest of my life by doing it. His name was Anwen. I had carried him on my shoulder the day after he was born, and he had pulled my beard. I would have known his face in the dark. I knew his face, I saw it, and then I saw her. And then I saw the silver. The light her child had kindled in her was still there. It had not faded. 2 crescent moons and a paw, traced in silver light below the hollow of her throat, glowing faintly through her thin shift like a lamp held behind silk. The crescent shapes I knew. The paw I knew. They were the mark of Whitemark, the moon-end paw of my own house, the mark every king of my blood is born with on his own right shoulder, and which his fated mate, when, in her lifetime, she meets him, receives across her own skin in answer. There has been one of these marks in every generation of my family for 9 generations. My grandmother bore one. My mother bore one. My father had searched 4 years for the woman whose skin held the answering moon, and when he found her, he had bent his knee in the middle of a market road, and she had laughed and pulled him up and taken him home, and married him in her own father's kitchen. I had been 31 years old and king for 9 of them, and had stopped, sometime around year 5, expecting to find mine. I had been wrong to stop. I see that now. I will spend the rest of my life being sorry for it. But that night, on the threshold of a healer's croft, 3 leagues past the bonewood, with my great wolf's flank against my leg and my dead sister's child asleep at the bare hollow of a woman's throat, and the silver moon-end paw of my own bloodline glowing softly on her skin, I had no time to be sorry. I had only time to do the next thing. I went down on one knee in her doorway. I am told later that Garin behind me put his hand on his sword for half a heartbeat, not because he thought I was in danger, but because he had never seen me kneel and he was not sure he was awake. I am told later that the 4 other riders behind him simply stopped breathing. I am told later that my great wolf laid down full length across the threshold beside me, not in the doorway, not blocking her, but with his great body angled toward her bare feet in the way a hound lays down at the foot of a chair he means to guard for the rest of his life. I knelt. I did not touch her. I did not speak for a long count because I could not. I looked up at the woman in the doorway with the silver moon at her throat and my sister's son in her arms, and I saw what no other man had bothered, in 25 winters of her life, to see. I saw a woman so used to giving warmth into other bodies that she had forgotten the warmth could ever come back into hers. I saw a quiet that was not emptiness but discipline, the discipline of someone who has learned, very young, that her own grief is not a thing the world is going to hold for her, and so she had learned to hold it herself in steady hands, the way she would hold a bowl too full of broth. I saw a face that had no idea how beautiful it was and would have refused to be told. I said on my one knee, "Lady, I am Halric of Whitemark. The child in your arms is my sister's son, whose name is Anwen. He was taken 8 weeks ago from a hold half a day's ride east. I have ridden every league of these marches looking for him. He is the only living blood of my own house I have left, and you have saved him." She did not speak. She looked at me a long time. She looked at Garin behind me and the 4 riders behind him and the wolves in the snow and my own great wolf laid down across her threshold. She looked back at me. Her free hand, the one not cupping the back of Anwen's small head, touched, very lightly, the front of her own collarbone, where the silver was, as if she had only that moment remembered it was there. "This light," she said, "came on him. I know. You know what it is." "I do. Tell me." I considered. I looked at her, kneeling in her doorway. I'm a man who has signed treaties and renounced kings and told widows their husbands were not coming home. I have learned in my work that you tell a person the truth in the dose she can carry. She had had a long night. She had a sick child against her body. She had not asked in 25 winters for any of this. She would not, I thought, want all of it at once. I said gently, "It is the answering moon of my house. There has been one of these marks on a woman of my blood in every generation for 9. It comes to the one a king of my line is meant for. I have never seen one in this world before tonight. My mother's was on her shoulder. Yours is." And I lifted my eyes to her throat and then, careful, away, where it is. I will not say more of it tonight if you would rather I did not. The child is what matters tonight. May we come in and look at him and warm ourselves and ride no further until the storm has passed. She thought about this for a long time. The storm pulled at the door behind me. Anwen made a small soft sound against her throat. Her hand on the back of his head did not move. "Come in," she said, "all of you. Bring the wolves in too if they want. I have soup." I will tell you about the soup, because she would want me to. She had set a small iron pot at the back of the hearth before she went out for her snares, with split barley and shin marrow and a knot of dried mountain thyme, and the soup had been quiet at the back of the hearth all the hours she had been out finding the child and bringing him home and warming him. She had not, until I knocked, remembered the soup. When she remembered, she went to it without fuss and brought it forward on the iron arm and stirred it twice with a wooden spoon, and tasted it from the spoon, and added 2 pinches of salt from a small earthen pot. And then she ladled soup into Bran's good wooden bowls, and gave one to me and one to Garin, and one to each of my 4 riders. And then she sat down in Bran's old chair with the child in her shawl and ate from a small clay cup. And the storm went on outside. And inside the small croft 6 grown men and 7 pack wolves and 1 alpha king ate barley soup in silence at a healer's hearth, and the bell behind my ribs rang and rang and rang, and the silver light at her throat dimmed to a soft glow, and then to a thread, and then to nothing visible. But I knew it was there. Under her skin, the way a moon is there behind a cloud. We talked then low, the way you talk in a room with a sleeping child. I told her more of what had happened. I told her the raid had been bad and that my sister and her husband were both gone, and that we had thought the child gone with them, and that 2 months ago a tracker had brought us a shred of blue cloth from his blanket on a thorn at the edge of the bonewood, and we had ridden every league of these marches since. I told her, for she asked, that I did not know how he had come to be at the altar. I had a guess. I told it to her. The raiders, I thought, had carried him as ransom or hostage in their flight, and one of them, perhaps a woman, perhaps a younger one, perhaps one whose own arms had once held a child, had set him down in the snow with his wolfskin wrap and his bone charm and walked away and not told the others. I will spend the rest of my reign looking for that woman. If I find her, I will not punish her. I will give her gold and a roof and ask her to come tell my sister's son, when he is grown, what she did and why. Soria, for I had asked her name by then, and she had told it the way she told everything, evenly, without ornament, said the swaddle had been good linen, and the bone charm a make from over the mountain. She turned the charm over in her free hand and showed me. It was a small carved wolf, curled, with a hole bored for the cord. She had seen one before, she said, in a trader's pack from the high passes. She thought the woman, whoever she had been, was from the high passes too. She thought, in other words, about the woman who had set the child down, without bitterness, without needing the woman to be a villain in order to make sense of the world, without needing, in fact, anything at all from the world except that the child be warm in her arms. She thought about the woman, and decided to think of her kindly, and went on stirring her clay cup of soup with a sliver of bread. I sat by her fire and ate her barley soup, and watched her think kindly of a stranger who had once held my sister's son. And I understood that I was, that night, going to do whatever it took to be a man worthy of standing inside the same room as her for the rest of my life. She would not let me say this. She does not let me say it even now when I try. She says I am king of a country and she is a healer of a single village, and that I am being grand. She says I should eat my soup. I ate my soup. The storm did not slack, it thickened. We were going nowhere that night. Garin and the 4 riders bedded down on her floor with their cloaks for blankets and our 7 wolves around them like a thick warm wall. The wolves loved her, by the way. They had come in single file behind me and gone, one by one, to lay their heads against her ankles, and she had touched each of their muzzles in turn with the same calm fingers she used on her sick. And I sat on a low stool by her chair, and we passed the rest of the night talking low, with Anwen asleep in her shawl. She told me about Bran and the goats and the cottage. She told me about the well women, briefly and without venom, and I learned with a quiet anger that I would have to keep to myself for several more days that they had been calling her the strange one asterisk and Bran's leftover and worse, and that the elder Maddock had once tried to give her to his own 43-year-old son, and she had refused with a bowl of porridge. She laughed when she told me that, the first laugh I heard from her, low and short like a single note plucked on a string. I made her tell it again so I could hear the laugh twice. She knew exactly why I was making her tell it again. She laughed at me too then, while she told it. I told her about Lyrian, about my parents, about the long quiet of my hall since the raid, about my mother's silver and paw mark, which had been across the back of her shoulder, and how she had let me touch it once when I was 4, and told me her mother's had been at her wrist and her grandmother's at her cheek, and that the moon liked to choose new places for her mark to come down, on each new woman, and that she did not know why. Soria touched lightly the place under her own throat. Mine came here. Yes. Why? I do not know. The moon does not tell me. She looked at me a long time. She said slowly, I have spent 25 winters not knowing where I come from. I do not know if my mother had a mark. I do not know if my mother had a face. I have learned to live without knowing. I do not need you to tell me tonight what this means about me. I would only like to ask you something else. Ask. This child, she said. He is your blood and your house is far from here and you will take him home tomorrow. I understand that. I am not arguing it. But he was very nearly gone when I found him, and I should like to ride with you to your hold and stay near him until he is past the place where a small one stops being likely to die. I should like, in other words, 2 weeks. 2 weeks at your hall as his healer. After 2 weeks I will come back here. Will you allow me that? She had set the whole thing up so that I could not say no without saying no to the child's health, which she had also correctly judged I would never do, and she had set it up also, so that nothing she said could be mistaken for a request that I take her home as my mate. She had heard me say silver and paw. She had heard the word answering moon. She had decided, in the time it took her to ladle soup into Bran's wooden bowls, that I might be a man who would seize that knowledge and use it on her. She had set the terms to protect herself. I have never in my life been more thoroughly admired by anyone than I admired this small, dark-haired healer in that moment. I cannot describe to you the warm ache in me. I will not try. I said 2 weeks, as his healer. You will have your own chamber and your own door and your own keys. You will come and go in my hold as a free woman. At the end of 2 weeks, if you wish to come back to read hello, my own riders will bring you home, and I will pay your village's tithe for the next 10 years from my own purse in your name, and you will never have to ask Maddock anything again. As to the silver, I will say no more of it than you ask me to say. Not tonight. Not in 2 weeks. Not in 2 years. Whatever you want to know, when you want to know it, I will tell you. Whatever you do not want, I will not press. You are a king, she said, and you do not know me. Why would you give me my own keys? Because, I said, the moon has made up its mind and I have made up mine, and yours has not been asked. I would like it to be asked. She looked at the fire a long time. All right, she said at last, 2 weeks. It was not, you understand, a yes to me. It was a yes to 2 weeks. I knew the difference. I held the difference very carefully in both hands, the way she had held the child, and I did not let it slip. The storm broke before dawn. We rode out at first light. She rode in front of me on my own saddle, because she did not have a horse and because Anwen, half-woken by the change, would not be put down. We wrapped them both in my great fur cloak with my arms outside it around them both, and my great wolf paced beside the saddle the whole way, and we crossed the Bonewood at the wide ford and were in sight of Whitemark Hold by the second evening. Whitemark Hold is the seat of my house, 8 towers around a stone court, a hall of dark beams and a great hearth, a moon window of pale glass set into the southern wall through which the silver of the full moon comes down once a month and lights the long table from above. It is a hall I have loved since I was a boy. I had been afraid, riding into it that evening with her in front of me on the saddle, that the hall would feel small to her or grand to her, that either feeling would put her off. I should not have worried. She looked up at it as we rode through the gate, and she said, evenly, Bran would have liked the stonework, and she did not look up again. She had places to be. She had a sick child to settle. The hall was the hall. The 2 weeks happened. I will not tell them as a slow tale, because I have been told to keep this story moving, and because the truth is that those 2 weeks were the slow happiest of my life, and they would put you to sleep. She settled Anwen into a small chamber off the south range with her own bed against the wall. She demanded, and got, a goat. She fed him goat's milk warmed in a copper bowl. He grew. His river-ice eyes went from glass to something more like Lyrian's, brighter and laughing. And on the 7th morning he laughed for the first time since he had been born, at a dust mote turning in a slat of sun. And Sorya, who had not been crying, turned her face into my shoulder while we both watched him do it. And I held the back of her head with my hand, and we did not speak. I gave her her own keys, as promised. I gave her her own door. I never crossed it without knocking. The well-women of Reedhello, who heard within 3 days where she had gone and with whom, sent a delegation through Maddock with a list of complaints and an offer of immediate marriage to Maddock's son after all. The messenger, an ashamed young pack-runner who had not wanted to be sent, delivered the list to my own chair in my own hall and waited to be shouted at. I did not shout at him. I sent him back with a small purse for himself, and a letter to Maddock telling him that the woman called Sorya was a free guest of Whitemark Hold and would remain a free guest as long as she wished, and that the tithe for Reedhello was, from this winter forward, paid by Whitemark, and that I expected no further letters. The young runner blinked at me and bowed and did not go home for 3 days because, I learned later, Sorya had set him to helping her grind willow bark in the still room, and he had been so charmed by her speaking to him as if he were a person that he had asked on the 3rd morning whether he might come back next winter and be apprenticed to her. She said she would think about it. He went home. 3 things happened in those 2 weeks that I will tell you, because they are the 3 things that made the rest of my life possible. The first happened on the 4th night. Anwen took a turn. He had been gaining ground steadily for 3 days, and then in the small hours of the 4th he spiked a fever, the kind small ones spike, sudden and high, and he began to cry the small thin cry that does not sound like a healthy child and does not stop. I was woken by a knock at my chamber door, Sorya herself in her shawl, her hair down, and she said evenly, Halric, come, he is hot. I followed her down the south range in my bare feet. She had stripped him to his linen and was wiping him with cloths wrung out in cool water and was singing. I do not know whether she knew she was singing. a low, tuneless, almost spoken thing under her breath, a kind of healer's humming. She showed me how to wring the cloths. She showed me where on him the heat was worst. She set me to keeping the cloths cold while she heated something on the small brazier, a steam of yarrow and thyme. And we worked, the two of us, side by side, for the better part of 3 hours. I held him while she dripped the cooled tincture between his lips with a clean reed. He drank. He cried less. Toward dawn the fever broke. He fell asleep against my collarbone, against the same collarbone, mind you, on which the moon-end paw of my house has been written since I was born. And Soria, kneeling beside me on the rug, put her hand on his back to feel the heat go out of him, and she let her forehead, for a count of 2, rest against my shoulder. I did not move. I did not speak. I would not that night have spoken if the hall had caught fire. After a count of 2 she straightened and gathered her cloths and stood up and said, "Good. He will sleep now," and went out and closed the door behind her. I did not sleep. I sat on the floor of that small chamber with my sister's son on my chest until the sun was high. I have known, since that night, what kind of woman the moon had given me. Everything that has happened since has only been the slow proving of it. The second thing happened on the 9th day. The kitchens at Whitemark, which are large and proud and have been run for 30 years by a woman named Inez, who came into them when my own mother was Luna, and who has buried 2 husbands and 1 son, and rules her saucepans with a hand that has been hard since long before she had any business being hard, sent up word, through a small messenger, that the still room had run dry of the cough tincture, and would the king's healer guest perhaps be able to make some, and would she perhaps be able to make some today? Because the second under-kitchener had a bad chest. Soria put down what she was doing, settled Anwen in his cradle with the goat bell beside it. She had tied a small bell at the foot of the cradle so that any kick of his small foot would call her, and the cradle had been chiming softly in the south range for 9 days, and went down to the still room. I followed at a distance, because I did not yet know how to be in the same hall as her without following, and I am not too proud now to admit it. I do not need to tell you the whole of the scene that followed. I will tell you only that Inez, who had been told by no one in particular that this was the unmarked woman from a village 3 leagues past the Bonewood with whom the king had ridden in out of a snowstorm, had decided in advance that she would not like her. Inez met Soria at the still-room door with the kind of folded arms that have started wars between kitchens and halls in my house before. Soria looked at the folded arms. Soria looked at Inez. Soria said, "Show me your willow bark. I will need a measure of meadowsweet too, if you have it dried. And if you can spare me for an hour, the youngest girl who has the steadiest hands, not the cleverest, the steadiest, I will teach her, while we work, how to make this so that you do not run out again in midwinter." Inez, who had not been spoken to like that in her own still room in 25 years, blinked once. Inez went herself and brought willowbark and meadowsweet and the youngest girl, whose name was Win and who had hands like a held breath. By supper time the second under-kitchener had drunk his first dose of the tincture, and the still room had 3 crocks of more, and Win, the youngest girl, had been, in Inez's own words, given back to me improved, and Inez had come up to my chair in the hall and stood beside it and said very low, "She is staying." Not as a question, as a statement of policy, I said, "We will see what she wants." Inez said, "We will see what she wants, my king, but I am telling you, she is staying." Inez went back to her kitchens. She has loved Soria since that day, with the kind of loyalty Inez used to keep only for my mother. She would burn the hall down for her. She has nearly done it twice on bread-baking days, but that is not this story. The third thing happened on the 11th evening, the night before she was to ride home. The full moon was high. The moon window of Whitemark Hall, the pale glass set high in the southern wall, which my grandfather's grandfather had set there for reasons that no living person now remembers, caught the moon and let it fall in a long silver lane down the dark of the empty hall, the way it has done once a month for 9 generations, and would do for 1 more, after I was dead. I had stayed late in the hall that night, in my own chair at the head of the long table, because I could not bear to go to my chamber knowing she would be gone from the south range by morning. I sat in the silver lane and watched the candles burn down, and I made myself, in the way a king must, the speech that goes, "She will come back. She said she would come back. You will be a man and let her go." I heard a step at the door behind me. I knew the step. She had walked the South Range 11 nights now in those bare feet, and I had learned the cadence of her without meaning to. She came in. She had Anwen in her shawl asleep. She came into the silver lane of the moon window. She did not see me at first in the chair beyond it, and she stopped and looked up at the high pale glass, and her own face went up into the silver. The light came down on her face and on the front of her throat, and the moon-end paw under her skin, which had been dim and dim and dim for 11 days, answered the moon. It lit, not a flicker, a lighting. The silver of her mark came up to meet the silver of the window like two lamps recognizing one another across a long room. Anwen, in her shawl, opened his eyes. He looked up into her face. He did not cry. He smiled. He raised, with the slow, lazy certainty of a small one who has not yet learned that not everything within reach is for him, his small hand up to her throat, and laid it on the warm silver, and made a small contented sound, and closed his eyes again. She stood in the silver lane of the moon window for a long count, holding my sister's son against the moon-end paw of my house, and she did not know I was watching. When at last she lowered her face and turned back toward the door, she saw me in the chair. She stopped. She did not flinch. "I did not mean to be in here," she said. "He was restless. The moon does him good." "Sorya," I said. She waited. "I do not need an answer tonight, or in a year, or in 10. I only need to ask you one thing now while the moon is up and you can see what I see. Do you understand, looking at yourself, what the moon has done?" She thought for a long time in the silver, with the child in her shawl. "I understand," she said evenly, "that the moon has put a mark on a healer's apprentice from Reedhello which the moon has not put on anyone else in 9 generations. I understand that you have a great hold and an empty Luna's seat and a child who needs raising." "I understand," she said, and her voice did not change, "that I have spent 25 winters being told by every village around me that I am of no value, and that if I let the moon or you or my own loneliness decide the question for me tonight in this silver, I will spend the rest of my life never being sure whether I would have chosen this if I had been allowed to choose it slowly. So I am asking you, Halric, for the year, not because I do not feel the moon, because I do." I stood up out of my chair. I crossed the silver lane to her. I did not touch her. I bowed my head instead the way I have bowed it twice in my life, once to my father in his coffin and once to my mother in hers, and I said, "Take the year, take 2, take 10, I will be here." She looked at me. She put her free hand very lightly on my bowed head, the way a healer puts her hand on the head of a sick one to feel the warmth, and she said, "Lo, thank you." Then she carried my sister's son back up to the South Range to put him to bed, and I stood in the silver lane of the moon window of my own empty hall, and I understood that the year she had asked for was, in fact, the proof that the moon had chosen well. In the second week she had also let me, one evening, sit on a low stool by her chair while Anwen slept, and tell her what the silver moon-end paw at her throat meant. I told her all of it. I did not soften it. I told her that the moon had decided once that her and I belonged in the same room for the rest of our lives, and that nothing, not the moon, not the mark, not me, required her to agree. I told her my mother had taken 3 months to make up her mind, and that my father had spent those 3 months carrying her firewood. I told her I had no firewood to carry her because she did not need any, but that whatever the equivalent was in her life, I would carry it for as long as she would let me. She listened, she thought. She said at the end, "I do not know yet." I said, "You do not need to know yet." She said, "I would like the 2 weeks to be over and to go back to Reedhello as we agreed, and to keep on with my work, and to come back here once a month for as long as the child needs me, and to think for a year about the rest. Can the rest of it wait a year?" I said, "It can wait 10. She said a year will do. She rode back to Reedhello on the morning of the 15th day, in a good winter cloak I had given her from my own stores, with her copper bowls and her good knives in a bundle behind her on a quiet brown mare from my own stable that I had given her also, because she could not be expected to walk the marches forever, and because if I could not give her my house, I could at least give her a horse. She kissed the top of Anwen's small head before she went. She did not kiss me. She gave me her hand at the gate of Whitemark and held mine for a count of 3 and let it go, and she said, "Halric, I will come back in a month." I said, "I know you will." She came back in a month. She came back the month after that. By high spring she had been to Whitemark Hold 5 times, and Anwen could sit up and grip her braid in his small fist when she leaned over him, and she had begun, between visits, to keep a small chamber of her own at Whitemark with her copper bowls and her good knives and a folded brown linen shift on the chair. By midsummer she had begun, between visits, to bring willowbark and meadowsweet from Reedhello, and to leave them in jars in the still room of Whitemark, in her own hand on labels of folded birchbark, and the kitchens had begun to come to her for the kinds of help no kitchen will admit it wants, and every kitchen needs. By autumn the council of my own pack, 3 old men who had not approved of much in my reign, and had certainly not approved of the silver moon-end paw of an unmarked woman from a village 3 leagues past the Bonewood, had begun, separately, each in their own way, to ask after her at supper. The eldest of them, who is named Eirik and who fought with my father, took me aside one evening in the south colonnade and said only, "She is a good woman, Halric. Do not be a fool." I told him I would try. I am still trying. It was high winter again, a clean, cold winter, a kind one, when she came to me in my own chamber at Whitemark, after a long day in the still room, with her braid down her back and her sleeves rolled at the wrists, and stood in the doorway with one hand on the jamb and said, "Halric, the year is up." "It is. I have thought." "Yes." She came across the chamber. She stopped a pace short of me. She lifted her hand to the front of her own collarbone, the way she had on the night I had first seen her, and she pulled the loose neck of her shift down a fraction, just enough to bear the silver, for it had been there under her skin all the year, glowing soft on certain nights and quiet on others, and on this night it was glowing softly, the 2 crescent moons and the paw in the small lamp under her skin. "You have your moon," she said, "and your hall, and your child. And you have this last year given me your 2 weeks 10 times over and never once made me ask. I have my answer. Tell me." "I am yours," she said, "if you want me." And she said it the way she said everything, evenly, without ornament, the truest thing she could say in the fewest words she had. I went down on one knee, the way I had on her threshold a year before, and I took her 2 hands in mine, and I said, "Sarya, I have wanted you since I knelt in your doorway and you would not let me say it, and before that since my great wolf wagged his tail in the snow, and before that since my mother stood me at a window when I was 4 and told me the moon kept watch on her children. I have wanted you, I think, since whatever woman in the high passes set down a half-frozen child at the foot of an alder and walked away. I will spend the rest of my reign being grateful that the moon brought us through a child to each other, and the rest of my reign being a man who never gives you any reason to wish she had not." She pulled me up. She married me in her own kitchen, at Brand's old hearth, in Reedhello in the spring, with the elder Maddox standing very small at the back of the room, and the well-women crowded into the doorway behind him with their hands over their mouths. She wore a clean, undyed linen shift, and a wreath of meadowsweet from her own banks. I wore the dark wool I rode in. Anwen, who was past a year by then and could stand if he had something to hold, held the hem of her shift with his small fist. My great wolf laid down across the threshold of the kitchen, the way he had laid down across her threshold once, and he wagged his tail twice, and was quiet. The well-women, afterward, brought us a great brown loaf and a jug of mead they had made themselves, and one of them, the oldest, who was named Hess and who had said the worst of the things, knelt down at Sorya's feet in the kitchen and put her old hands on Sorya's knees and asked, very low, to be forgiven. Sorya bent her head down to her and said something into her ear I did not hear. Hess wept. Sorya put her hand on Hess's hair and held it there until Hess was done. Then Sorya stood up and went back to slicing the bread, and Hess sat on a bench near the hearth and ate with the rest of them, and I understood, for the second time in my life, the first having been the night I knelt in her doorway, what kind of woman the moon had chosen for me. Maddox did not weep. Maddox simply, when the bread was finished, came across to me with his cap in his hands and said he had been a fool. I told him most of us had been. I told him the tithe was paid for 10 years and the village should put the saved silver into a new well because the old one was bad, which Sorya had told me 3 months before on one of our long rides home. Maddox said he would. He has. The well has good water now. Reedhello has 30 new lambs. Hess teaches the youngest of the well children to plait reed mats, and once a winter she rides up to Whitemark with a sack of them across her saddle, and Sorya pays her in goat's cheese and willow bark tincture, the way Bran once paid the rent. Anwen is 8 winters old now as I write this down. He is tall for his age. He has Lyrian's eyes and her quick laugh and her bad habit of asking questions in the middle of supper that no one wants to answer. He calls Sorya by no formal name. He calls her Sora Asterisk, and he calls me whatever I am at the moment, sometimes Halric, sometimes Uncle sometimes, when he is sleepy and unguarded, the small word he has used for me since he could speak, which is not a word any other living creature is allowed to use on me, and which I will not write down even here. He has a sister now who is 4, whose name is Lyrian for my own, and a brother who is 2 and a stout small thing with his mother's quiet, whose name is Bran. The silver moon end paw on Sorya's throat has dimmed, the way these marks dim across a long good marriage, to a faint trace under the skin you can only see when she is laughing very hard or when the full moon is high. But on each of our 3 children, on the soft skin at the inside of the right wrist, there is the smallest possible silver paw the size of a thumbprint, which my mother once told me marks the children of an answering moon marriage, and which I have never asked anyone, including the moon, to explain. I write this at the long table in the hall of Whitemark, under the moon window, at the start of the 2nd hour after midnight on the 8th winter, since I knelt in the doorway of a healer's croft, 3 leagues past the bonewood. Sorya is asleep upstairs with our youngest curled against her shoulder. Anwen, who could not sleep tonight, is asleep on a fur at my feet beside my great wolf, who is gray at the muzzle now and slower in the cold but whose tail still thumps the floor when she comes into a room. The fire is low. The hall is quiet. The wind outside is the same wind that, 8 winters ago, took the snow off a small bundle at the foot of an alder and showed it to a woman who was already, though she did not yet know, the moon's answer to a question my house had been asking for 9 generations. I lay down the pen. I look at my sister's son asleep with his small hand fisted in my wolf's gray ruff. I think, and I will not say what I would say to the woman in the high passes if I could find her tonight. I think, and I will not say what I would say to old Bran if he were here, who once told me in passing that his apprentice had the gift in her fingers and the grief in her heart, and that both of those were needed. I climb the stairs. I open the chamber door very softly. Sorya, in the dark, turns her face toward the door, the way she always has, and reaches her hand out across the empty side of the bed without waking, and the smallest possible silver light flickers once at the hollow of her throat where my house's moon-end paw has lived now for almost a decade, and she says, half asleep, in a voice she has used on me for 8 winters and will use for as many more as we are given, "There you are." I close the door behind me. The moon comes through the high window. The wolf at the foot of the bed lifts his head once, sees me, lays it back down. I lie down beside my wife in the dark of my own house, and put my hand in the dark, on the place at the hollow of her throat where the silver was, that first night. The night a child she had found in the snow set the lamp of my whole life alight inside her skin without either of us knowing it, and her fingers close around mine, in the dark, The way they have closed around small, frightened, sick, warm things since she was old enough to hold a bowl, with all the patience of all the world. There you are, I think back at her, in the dark without speaking it. There you are,